We're gonna go over everything you need to know about using containers in Elementor. We're gonna take a look at how everything works and how you can use containers in the most efficient way possible, which will make your work a lot easier. Even if you know how to use containers already, I promise that by the end of this video, you're gonna learn something new. This video also has chapters, so you can skip to the part of the video that you need. However, if you're new to using containers, you're gonna want to watch everything from start to finish. My name's Tim, and with all of that said, let's quickly jump into the video. And when we're talking about quickly, I just have to mention Cloudways. I collaborated with them to bring you this video, and I want to tell you about their super quick hosting plans. With Cloudways, you can choose servers from different providers such as DigitalOcean, Vultr, Linode, and even Amazon or Google. You can select, customize, and launch your server and website in just a couple of clicks. What's really awesome is that you get to decide how many server resources you need, how powerful you want your server to be, and where in the world you want that server to be located. And even though they give you a lot of control over your setup, it's still a very quick and easy process. But while an easy website setup is a huge plus, the main thing Cloudways is known for is their amazing performance. Starting at just $14 a month, their DigitalOcean micro plan is perfect for small to medium-sized websites. And if you need a more powerful server in the future, upgrading is very quick and very easy. Being able to instantly upgrade your server is also great for WooCommerce stores, especially new or small ones. It helps you accommodate more website visitors and checkouts when you're expecting or experiencing an increase in website visits. Oh, and for the Cloudways flexible plans, you can add as many applications to a server you want. An application is what Cloudways calls a website. Just keep in mind that each website will take up additional server resources. I've used their flexible plans in the past, and I can personally confirm that they definitely deliver when it comes to performance. I also really appreciate the fact that they have a bunch of tutorials available for you to read when you're in need. It makes finding answers quick and easy. When it comes to performance, if you need something even more powerful, Cloudways Autonomous is a great solution. I used it to host a client project last year, and it was by far the fastest loading website I've ever built. And I'm not just saying that, it actually loaded incredibly quickly. The client I used it for had a big launch coming up, and we needed to make sure that the website could handle a lot of visitors. The reason I use Cloudways Autonomous is because it allows automatic scaling of server resources, which basically means that if your website has a massive spike in traffic, it still won't slow down or crash. Your hosting plan will adapt, and the website will stay fast and efficient. Another unique thing about them is that they don't require you to pay for yearly plans to get discounts. You're always going to be paying monthly, so you're never risking paying for resources and servers that you aren't actually using. You can monitor the billing in real time as well, which allows you to see an estimated amount you're gonna have to pay for your server. You can see your charges so far for the current month and an estimated final price at the end of the month. This pay-as-you-go model is a lot more transparent than those of many shared hosting providers whose monthly subscriptions can get really expensive once those initial discounts end. They also offer a bunch of add-ons that can improve your experience even further. The one I find really impressive is Cloudflare Enterprise. This is an extra boost to the security and the performance of your website, and it's usually really expensive. Cloudways, however, offers it for just $5 monthly per domain. Awesome value. And the best part is that you can try out their hosting for free for 3 days with absolutely zero risk. There's no credit card required for the free trial, and on top of that, Cloudways was kind enough to offer an awesome 30% discount on your first 3 invoices if you use the code REALEZA when signing up. Click the link in the description and try it out. And thank you, Cloudways, for sponsoring this video. First, let's go over what containers are, how they work, and how to plan your layouts. You can think of containers as building blocks. You can stack them on top of each other or place them inside one another. Placing containers inside one another is called nesting. And when you place a container inside of another container, you create a parent-child relationship between them. The container that gets placed inside the other container becomes that container's child element. The container that gets the container placed inside of it becomes a parent element. This applies to widgets as well. If you place a heading inside of a container, the container is now that heading's parent element. You can nest containers indefinitely, meaning you can add in as many as you want. This is important because the controls that set the direction of your containers, the gaps between them, the padding, and so on are all based on this very simple concept. And even if you never came across this terminology or explanation before, you've been using it every time you use Elementor. Containers are incredibly versatile and they allow you to create very complex layouts. With that said, one really common mistake a lot of people make is using containers when they just aren't needed. Using too many containers can slow down your website. But what is almost guaranteed to happen is that too many unnecessary containers will make your workflow a whole lot more difficult than it needs to be. So before we jump into Elementor, let me tell you how I plan my layouts in advance before I begin building them to avoid this mistake. When I look at a layout, I visually try to break it down into containers. What do I mean by that? Let's take a look at the Figma file, which features some very common layouts. Let's use this section as an example. When I look at this, I see I'm going to have to use 5 containers. One main container, which I'm going to place all of the content of this entire section inside of. Another container for my 3 columns or cards, whatever you want to call them. And then each of these columns needs its own container. That brings us to a total of 5 containers. If my heading here or my call to action had some other elements around them, depending on how much control I want to have, maybe I would add a container on the top and on the bottom as well, for a total of 7 containers. Now, of course, you don't need to know exactly how many containers you're going to be using in advance. You can always easily add or remove them when you need to. But I think that it's a great idea to visualize the layout and break it down into smaller parts before you begin working, especially if you're new to using containers or if you have to build complex layouts. Once you get a few reps under your belt, you're not going to need to do this, or rather you're going to do it without even thinking about it. It's going to come naturally and you'll just know what you need to do in order to build a certain layout. Okay, I think it's time we jump into Elementor. Before we continue, if this video is helpful, please make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons. Be a doer, not just a viewer. It really does help me out a whole lot. I'm gonna open up my page, I'm gonna press edit with Elementor, and now we are ready to add in a container. I'm gonna press this plus over here, and the first thing I'm asked is which layout I would like to use. We're going to go over grids later on in the video. For the large majority of things you're going to be building, you're going to be using Flexbox containers. Grids can be great and very helpful, but they are very limited. You can build pretty much anything you can build with grids with just containers, but you can't build most things you can build with containers with grids. So let's choose Flexbox. Now we're asked to select our structure. The first 2 options will add in a single container. The only difference between them is the direction of that container. The first option, called direction column, means that the items in your container are going to stack on top of each other. The second option, direction row, means they're going to be next to each other. I'm going to explain this in more detail later in the video. The other options will automatically add in more containers in different layouts. I pretty much always just choose the first one because I prefer adding the containers I need and adapting their settings as I go. This way I can start with a blank piece of paper, so to speak. With that said, you can very easily use some of these other pre-made layouts. It's not at all difficult to add in more containers though, so the pre-made layouts are, in my experience, not that useful. So I'm going to choose the first option. One thing you'll notice as soon as I add it in is that there's a little bit of space all around the container. You can't see it over here, but it's here as well. This is the default padding in Elementor. You can remove it by going into the container, going under advanced, and pressing this button to unlink the values. Or you can remove it entirely by going into the site settings and going under layout and removing or changing it here. Just be careful because once you do that, it's going to change it for every container on the whole website that has the default padding applied. If you remove padding entirely and you add in a new container, it's going to be very hard to select the correct container, which is why the structure window is so important. So now I have my first container and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to nest a container. So I'm going to add another container inside of it. Once I do that, I'm going to go into the first container. I'm just going to go under advanced and I'm going to give it some padding on the top and on the bottom, just so my other container isn't stuck to the top over here. So now I have my first container and I have a container nested inside of it. And over here in my structure, you can see that my containers are showing up. Let's go over a few features of the structure window and how it can improve your workflow. In the structure tab, all nested elements have an indent on the left and all containers have a drop-down arrow. If you click that arrow, you can see all of the elements that are inside of that container. So my first container only has this container inside of it, and my second container is empty. One really important piece of advice that I can give you is to name your containers. This is going to help keep everything organized and easy to understand. With 2, 3, 4 containers, it doesn't really matter, but the more containers you have, the more difficult it is to make sense of things if they aren't properly labeled. Name your containers, it is worth the extra time. You can do that by double-clicking on the container in the Structure tab and just typing in whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right-click this container, the one I just named whatever, and I'm going to duplicate it. Currently, my first whatever container and my second whatever container are on the same level. I could also go ahead and right-click and press Add New Container, which is going to add a container on the same level, meaning all of these three, so my first whatever, my second whatever, and my third container, which is just named container, are all children of my largest container. By using the Structure tab, I can reorder them by dragging and dropping them. I can also nest them, so I can add in this container inside of this container, and then I can go ahead and add in this container inside of this container. You can also go ahead and right-click and press copy, and then you can paste it anywhere, even inside of itself. So I have my container over here. I'm gonna rename it to 1. I'm gonna right-click, I'm gonna press copy, and then I'm gonna go ahead and right-click it again and press paste. And I just nested another container, a duplicate of this one, inside of itself. Copy pasting is a good way to copy containers and place them directly where you want them. That's pretty much all you need to know about the Structure tab. It's really important when you're working with containers, so get familiar with it. I'm gonna delete all these containers. They're nested, so when I delete them, I'm gonna delete their children as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and right-click and press delete. I'm gonna go back into my original container. Under layout, the first thing you can do is change the container layout. We can choose between flexbox and grid, but since we don't want to change anything, we're gonna leave it as is. The next choice we need to make is about our content width. If we keep it boxed, by default, it will be limited to the width we have set up in our site settings. In my case, that is 1400 pixels. So if I open up my site settings, go under layout, this is that value. I set it up to 1400 pixels. Usually this only applies to desktop since it's larger than a tablet or mobile anyhow, which means that it will basically act as full width on those devices. What this means in practice is that the max width of anything we add inside of this container will be 1400 pixels. If I add in another container, by default, it is set to full width. But because the parent container is set to boxed, the total width is still limited to 1400 pixels. If I set the parent container to full width, now it's gonna go from the left edge of the screen to the right edge of the screen, no matter the resolution. And the container nested inside of it can actually now take up that much space. But I'm gonna set it back to boxed. If I add in another container, I can do that by going ahead and just right-clicking and pressing duplicate. They are on top of each other. If I go ahead and go under items and change the direction to row horizontal, we can see that each container now takes up 50% of the space. If I add in another, each takes a third of the space, and so on and so on. We can change whether they're next to each other or on top of each other by going under items and changing the direction. So row horizontal means they're going to be next to each other, and column vertical means they're going to be on top of each other. More on this later in the video. We can even control the width of each container individually. We can get 2 on the top and 1 on the bottom, or any other combination, but we're going to get to that later in the video. If I go ahead and add in a background color to the largest container, the background color is applied to the entire width of the screen, even when it's set to boxed. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it, and if I add it to any of the nested containers, it's only going to take up as much space as that container, even if it's set to full width. I'm going to go ahead and remove it, and we're going to go back into our parent container. The next thing we can set is a min height. Adding in a min height means that the container is going to be at least as tall as the value we set over here. If we set it to 100 VH, it got just a little bit bigger because I already added quite a bit of padding. If it's set to 100 VH, it's going to take up at least the entire height of the viewport. I say at least because if the content inside of the container is, let's say, 600 pixels tall and the min height is set to 300 pixels, it's still going to be larger than the min height because it's the minimum, not the maximum. If you want to know more about units in Elementor, how they work, and when you should use which, I have an amazing video about that, so go check it out. The link will be in the description. But after min height, we get into the really important settings. Under items, we have direction, justify content, align items, gaps, and wrap. We're gonna go over each of these individually. Under direction, we already saw what direction does a little earlier. I'm gonna change it back to row horizontal. I'm gonna go ahead and add in a heading and a background color to my first and second container, so we can see the effect of what we're doing more easily. I'm gonna name the first one container 1. I'm gonna make the background color yellow, and I'm gonna name the second one, I'm just gonna copy and paste the heading, name it container 2, and I'm gonna make the background color purple, and I'm gonna remove the third one. Now you may be wondering why they're so tall, why they're so big. That is because the parent container has a min height of 100 VH. So I'm just gonna go ahead and remove that so we just get the actual size of the containers. And following my own advice, I'm gonna go ahead and rename them in the structure as well. So container 1, container 2. So when I'm changing the direction, all that it's doing basically is just changing if it's vertical or horizontal. And all of these settings work for all elements. Meaning if I add in a heading to my parent container, so the largest container, which I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to drag it in. As you can see, if I place it in here, it's going to nest it into this container, but I want to nest it into the parent container. So I drag that in, and if I go ahead and I now change the direction, you can see it applies to the heading as well. The width of everything is kind of messed up. The containers are pretty large. The heading is very tiny. But we're going to get into that in a second. I'll remove this heading for now. The other two row settings are row reversed and column reversed. They do exactly what the name implies, they reverse the order. So if I select row reversed, now my second container is at the start and my first container is at the end. Same for column reversed, but vertically. My second container is on the top and my first container is on the bottom. For desktop, you won't be using these two options much. They're much more helpful for tablet and mobile. One example where I use these directions often is if I'm building a horizontal text image layout. It's a very common layout. Let's say I have my text on the left and my image on the right. Like I mentioned earlier, due to width reasons, I would make sure each of these elements is in its own container. And then I would have the direction of my parent container set to row horizontal. On tablet and mobile, however, I don't have enough space for them to be next to each other, nor do I want them to be next to each other because they would be completely squished. So I want the image to be on the top and the text to be on the bottom. If I set it to column vertical, the text, which is the first element, is on the top and the image is on the bottom. To get the order that I want, I'm going to use column reversed. This is a pretty basic example, but I use these settings a lot when working with containers. When it comes to ordering content inside of a container, we can fine-tune it even further. We can give each individual element its own order by going under Advanced and Order. We can choose Start or End to move it to the start or end of its parent container. In this case, I have a layout with 6 different containers, so if I set the order of my first container to end, it's going to place it at the end. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to go ahead and unclick it. But the real magic happens over here, custom. By giving containers or widgets a custom order, you can very easily completely reorder elements for different devices. It doesn't really make sense to use this for desktop. For desktop, you want to add things in the exact order you want them to be in the first place, which means reordering them this way is pointless. But for responsiveness, it's awesome. A good example is this repetitive left-right layout, which is pretty common, but it's in a zigzag pattern, which means that if I go into tablet, I have my images on top of each other and my text on top of each other, which is probably not something you want. So we can use custom order. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go into my image container. And I'm going to give it a custom order of 1. As soon as I do that, instead of going up, it goes to the end. That is because each of these containers by default has an order of 1. So we need to add an order to each of them. I'm going to go ahead and give my second container a value of 2. So immediately after doing that, I get the image on the top and text on the bottom, which is the reverse of what I have on desktop. On desktop, I have the text on the left and the image on the right. The next container with this image, I'm going to give it an order of 3. My next text container is going to get an order of 4. Then again, I have to mix it up for these. So I need to give this container an order of 6 to push it all the way down. And I need to give this container an order of 5. And what I got now is an image, text, image, text, image, text layout. Exactly what I wanted. And if you want to reorder even more elements, you just follow the same process. On mobile, I could also reorder them however I want. This is really powerful, but it's also something I don't use often. That's because layouts where I want to completely reorder things are honestly pretty rare. Usually the row reversed or column reversed does exactly what I need. And the second reason is because it can get quite confusing. You can probably imagine how this can get messy if you have a bunch of elements you need to reorder. The next important setting is justify content. This basically decides how the content inside of a container is going to be aligned horizontally. No matter what I click, nothing happens, and that is because all of my containers are taking up an even amount of space. They're all taking up 33% of the space. There's no extra space available anywhere besides this padding that I added, so they don't get aligned differently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set each of these containers to have a width of 20%. So I'm going to make them a lot smaller. Now I have a bunch of empty space over here, and the justify content is actually going to change their position. If I set it to center, it's going to center it inside of this parent container. If I set it to end, it's going to move it to the end. Then we also have space between, space around, and space evenly. The difference between these three options is that space between places the first item at the start of the container and the last item at the end of the container, and the remaining space is distributed equally between the other elements. Space around distributes the space around all items equally. Each element gets some space before and after. This means that there's also space before the first item and after the last item, and because of that, the space at the start and at the end, it's half of the space between items. This happens because each individual item has equal space on the left and on the right, so the space in between is doubled. And space evenly distributes the space so that the spaces between the items and the edges of the container are equal. I most often use start or potentially space between. I rarely control the actual space between items by using any of these three options, but you can if you want to. I never actually use the last two options. Then we get to align items. This is similar to justify content, but it's for vertical alignment. Because all of my containers have the same height, again, nothing happens no matter which option I choose. So I'm going to add some padding to the first container. I'm going to give it 60 pixels on the bottom and 60 pixels on the top. When I do that, besides this container, the parent container, the one with the white background, these two also get larger. We can control that by using align items. By default, it's set to stretch, so if I set it to stretch, nothing happens. But if I select start, however, the individual nested containers are going to only be as big as their content. So the first one, because of the padding, is large, and the second and the third are exactly the same as they were. The practical difference between stretch and start can be seen over here. These two cards have less text than these two. If I leave the align items of the parent container as it is or set to stretch, the card itself, so the background and the entire thing, is still exactly the same size as the other ones, even though the content is much smaller. However, if I set it to start, now each box, each container is only as tall as its actual content. Center and end only align the items to, well, the center and at the end. But the cool thing is that we actually have these options available for each individual container as well. So I'm going to go ahead and in the parent container, I'm going to keep it on stretch. And then I'm going to go into this container. The option we're looking for is under advanced and it's called align self. If I set the align self of this container to start, it's still only going to be as tall as its content, even though the parent container is set to stretch. And stretch basically just means they're all the same size. By using align self, you can control each element individually. For example, if I set it to end, it's going to align to the bottom. If I set it to center, it's going to be centered. This is very, very useful. It also works for widgets. I have this container set to align items at the start. But if I go into this icon over here and I set the align self to end, it's going to be on the right side. I can align it to the right even if everything else is aligned to the left. Really useful, really powerful. Next up, we have gaps. This just controls the space between individual items inside of a container. The column gap controls the horizontal space and the row gap controls the vertical space. You can unlink this and set different values for the horizontal and the vertical, and you can use any unit you want. I usually use REM. I'm going to leave it as is, so to REM, which is what I have set in my site settings under layout over here. So you can set the default gap of every container on your whole website over here. The last setting we need to go over under layout is wrap. If you use no wrap, which is what is activated by default, items will always stay within a single line. So if I go ahead and duplicate this, no matter how many times I do that, it's gonna stay in a single line. Their width doesn't matter. I can go ahead and set this width to 80% and I can set the width of this one to 10. It doesn't matter. It's always gonna stay in one line. And as you can imagine, this can quickly become a problem. We technically have unlimited space vertically on websites, but horizontal space is pretty limited. Even for full width layouts, if you add in too much content, it's gonna look cramped. And for tablet and mobile, the horizontal space is even more limited. So you can set it to row, vertical. But what if you want 2 containers or 2 elements in one line and 2 in the other and so on, or even perhaps 3 in one line and 1 in the other? That is where wrap comes into play. When your container is set to no wrap, your elements are never gonna break into multiple lines. But when it's set to wrap, it's going to make items within the container break into multiple lines if the total width of the items exceeds 100%. So if you have a container set to 40% and the other container set to 40%, I'm going to delete this one. Even if you have wrap turned on, it's not going to break into multiple lines. But if I go ahead and I make the second one 70%, suddenly we get 2 lines. But even if I set both of them to 50%, which is what you would probably expect isn't gonna break into multiple lines, it stays in 2 lines. It's still broken up. That's because wrap also takes into account the gaps. So the gaps between your elements, your containers, they're added to this total. Since my gap is set to 2 REM and each container is set to 50%, the total is 100% plus 2 REM, which is more than just 100%. That is one of the current downsides of containers. It's fairly easy to fix, but it would be much easier if the gaps were just ignored in this equation, so hopefully that changes in the future. We need to figure out what percent to set the width of our individual containers at. I'm going to set the width of the first one to 48.75%, and yes, this is a little bit ridiculous. I'm going to show you a better way in just a second. I go ahead and I copy this width to the second one, it works, even with the gap. But if I go ahead and publish this page in preview, and I go into responsiveness, you're gonna see that on smaller desktop devices, it's still gonna break into 2 lines. If I set these to 48.25, it would be okay on smaller desktop screens as well. But if I do that, or if I make it any smaller, I'm just gonna set it to 48. Let's round it down a little bit. You can see that the space on the left side, which is just the padding of the parent container, and the space on the right side are not even. The right side has quite a bit more space. That is where setting the justify content of our parent to space between might come into play. But now this space is larger. Luckily, the fix for this is fairly easy. We can go into each individual container. Let me just make this structure a little bit smaller. We can go under Advanced, go under Size, and set it to Grow. If I do that for both of them, now my padding is symmetrical. It is as it should be. It is 40 pixels. And the gap between them is 2 rem. It's no longer larger. Even if your width now isn't perfectly accurate, the spacings and the sizes are going to be correct. The width of each individual container still has to account for the gaps, however. So over here I have 3 containers, and if I set each container to 33%, it's still not gonna work. Even if I set them to grow, it's not gonna work. Their individual width has to be sufficiently smaller, so the width of the containers plus the gap is still under a total of 100%. In this case, if I set them to 30%, it's gonna work perfectly fine. So just keep that in mind. Go a little lower with your width. This is really important when it comes to responsiveness. If you have 4 columns in desktop, maybe you want 2 on tablet. So let's go into this container and go into tablet mode. As you can see, I have the direction set to column vertical. If I set it to row horizontal with no wrap, this is the result. Probably not what you want. If I set it to wrap, we're in the same position. On desktop, I don't need wrap because I want 4 columns, but on tablet, I do. I'm gonna go into each individual container and I'm gonna go under Advanced and I'm gonna set their size to grow. So that's the first thing I'm gonna do, and then I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna adjust their individual width. So I'm gonna go into the first one and I'm gonna set its width to 45%. I'm gonna go into the second one, do the same thing. And as soon as I do that, they're no longer each in its own line. They're next to each other. Exactly what I want. I'm gonna do the same for the third and the fourth one. I could just go ahead and copy the style, but same thing. And now if I just go into my parent container and I set the align items to stretch, they're gonna be the same size, and I have them 2 by 2. I could even do 3 by 3 if I made them small enough. So let's say if I made them 30%, now I get 3. So this is how you control how many elements you can have in a single line. But Grow is also great for aligning content. All of these cards are the same height, but the content itself isn't. This is very common. But I still want my icon, my arrow over here, to be aligned to the bottom. One way to do this is by adding in extra containers. But that way you're adding in unnecessary elements to your website, and actually the better way that I'm about to show you is much easier. And that way is using Grow. So I'm gonna go ahead and go into my text editor. I'm gonna go under Advanced. I'm gonna set its size to grow. And as soon as I do that, it fills up all of the available empty space, which pushes this icon to the bottom, exactly where I want it. This is a very cool solution to a very common problem. When using this, if your container direction is set to row horizontal, the elements inside of it are gonna grow horizontally. And if it's set to column vertical, they're gonna grow vertically. All of this also applies to other elements, not just containers. So I have another container over here, and I added in some widgets, an icon, a heading, and a text editor. You're gonna see by default that these are all full width. The actual content of the widgets may not be full width, but the widget itself is. If I go ahead and I go into the container and I change my alignment, so I use one of the align item options, you're gonna see that now the widgets are as large as their actual content. They're no longer full width. We can also use wrap and all of these options. You can even give individual elements their own width by going under advanced, width, and using custom. And then over here you can use pixels, percent, any unit you want. However, I generally avoid this. I use it sometimes, but not often. I prefer controlling the width of images or icons directly. So by controlling their size under style. For example, I can make this icon larger by giving it a size of 100 pixels. In general, I like to control the width of things on the container level. One reason is that it's just easier to use an extra container here and there. It gives me more control, and I always know where the settings are located. I'm not saying go crazy and use a container for every single thing, but honestly, it's no big deal if you use an extra container every once in a while. I think that is a better option compared to doing more work to achieve the same thing with less containers. Of course, it depends on how much extra work there is and how many containers you use, but as long as you try to keep it down to a minimum without going crazy with these settings, it should be perfectly fine. Plus, it's better for clients that want to make adjustments themselves as well. They always know where they can find the settings to control the width. They know they need to look at the container. I know a lot of tutorials like to use this custom width, they like to use negative margins, absolute positioning, and all of that stuff just to avoid using too many containers. But that makes for a website where it's really difficult to know how things are set up unless you're the one who set it up. And even if you are the one working on the project, probably you're going to be working on other projects as well, which means that by the time you get asked to do something on your previous website again, you probably forgot where all of these settings are, and you're going to be left clicking and looking and trying to find things. But if you use width at the container level, you're always going to know that is where you can find it. So personally, I rather have an extra container here and there because it helps keep things organized. The other reason that I avoid setting the width of my widgets is that there is a bug in Elementor that's been around for a while. You might have noticed it. With certain widgets on mobile, the content starts overlapping, widgets hide behind other widgets. It's really annoying and it actually completely breaks layouts. And the easy fix for it is to go into the widget that is causing the problem, go under advanced and set the width to full width. It doesn't always show up. I don't know what makes it happen, but it definitely happens often enough for me to kind of subconsciously avoid using the width to set the size of my widgets. It's very common when it comes to images, which means it's very common because we use images all of the time. Here's an example of it happening with a loop grid widget. Here's what it's supposed to look like, and here's what it looks like without the fix. If we go into any container, under layout, additional options, we can set our overflow. If you ever built something and noticed extra empty space on the side of the screen, the cause is likely an element that's too large for its container. This makes your website scrollable left to right, horizontally, even though you probably don't want that. A good example would be a heading that is set to a size that makes it larger than its container, and then it overflows. By setting the overflow of a container to hidden, you make sure the content that's overflowing out of the container isn't going to be visible and it isn't going to enable horizontal scrolling. And when it comes to the HTML tag, the main thing you're likely going to need is a link. This is how you add a link to the entire container. Combined with some cool hover effects, you can make really cool clickable content. Speaking of cool hover effects, I made an awesome video about that. In the video, I show you how to change the color of the container on hover and the colors of headings, text editors, and icons inside of it. I also show you how to resize or rotate anything on hover. It's a great video and it's really simple to do, The link will be in the description, so go check it out. Once you add in your link, you can go ahead and set the link options. You can open it in a new window and you have all of the other standard link options as well. One really important thing to keep in mind is that once your container has a link applied to it, there should be no other link anywhere in that container. If there is, it's going to break the layout. And last but not least, or actually, well, it is the least, and I'm going to explain why in a second, let's take a look at the grid container. When adding in new containers, just like we saw in the beginning, you can choose to use a grid. Grids allow you to control the number of columns and rows incredibly easily. All of the extra steps we took to make sure our containers break into lines properly by using wrap and width and grow and all of that stuff, all of that is taken care of automatically when it comes to grids. Because of that, grids are fantastic for repetitive content. What I mean by that are things like team members, where you only have a name and a picture, or logo showcases, things like that, things that are consistent in their size. Let's say you want to create a layout where you have 4 team members in a row, just like here. You have a total of 7 team members, or TIM members, I should say, and you want 2 rows. You just create a grid, you add in a container, add in an image, add in your text, and then just duplicate it 7 times. And then you adjust the content. So you change out the pictures, you change out the names, and all of that stuff. And after that, you can go into the grid, go under layout, and under items, you can select how many columns and how many rows you want. If I set this to 3, you're going to see it automatically resizes and moves everything accordingly. If I set it to 5, same thing. 6, 7, it doesn't matter. It does everything automatically. I usually just set columns because the rows adjust automatically. So if I set it to 2, you're going to see I get enough rows to fit all of the content, to fit all of these 7 items. So I set it to 4 columns, and that's it. Now let's say I want 2 columns on tablet. No problem, I'm just going to go into my tablet mode and set it to 2. It's already set to 2, but if I set it to 3, it works perfectly. No issues at all, same thing on mobile. Extremely easy. Then again, we have our gaps, and then we have autoflow. By default, it's set to row, and that's also how I always use it. What this determines is basically where content will get added. If it's set to row, it's going to get added from left to right. So if I go ahead and I remove all of my duplicates, so if I just go ahead and keep 1, and then I go ahead and I duplicate the first one, you're going to see it gets added to the right side. If I go ahead and duplicate it 3 more times, it's going to break into a new row and it's going to go below the original one. So that is when it's set to row. When it is set to column, however, it works differently. To have it work correctly when set to column, you also have to set the number of rows, which you didn't have to do previously. So I'm going to set the number of rows to 6. Instead of content being added to the right side and filling like this, it's going to get added below it until it fills all of the rows. And once it does that, if I set it to 4 rows instead of 6, the next one is going to go back to the top to the right of the first one. I never really use this. I just really prefer using row. Don't actually see much of a need to use column, but it is an option. Then we have our justify and align options for content that varies in height. So once I remove that text, if I change the alignment to center, it's going to center it. If I change it to end, it's going to place it at the end. So same thing as with our Flexbox containers. Under items, you can also hide the grid outline, but I like to have it visible. It only shows up for you when editing, so it won't show up on the live page. If we go into individual containers inside of my grid, so grid items, these could also be just widgets, but again, I prefer using containers. In this case, I have to use containers because if I just added in an image, that image would then be its own grid item, and I could not go ahead and add in a heading because that would be its own grid item as well. So it has to be a container, so I can add in multiple elements. You can't add in multiple elements without them being their own grid items unless you use containers. So if I go into my container, go under advanced, you can now see we now have two new options. Under grid item, we have column span and we have row span. This allows you to determine how much space each grid item should take. For example, you can set one of the grid items to take up the space of 2 columns. The rest of the grid will adapt automatically. You can use this to create some very cool layouts, such as having one row with 4 items, another with 2, then 4 again, and so on. Or really any combination you want. Same for the row span. I can imagine this one being useful for a few things, but I haven't used it on a production website yet. So why don't I use grids often? And why aren't they more popular? I think it comes down to 2 very important reasons, which are height and alignment. On desktop, in my case, all of this works perfectly fine. I have my Tim members, and even if I don't have a name under one of them, it's fine. The gaps are fine, no issues. The problem is that no matter what you do, no matter which settings you use for individual grid items, the individual grid item will always be as tall as the tallest element in the grid. What this means is that on tablet and mobile, you can set the gap of the grid to say 20 pixels. But because one grid item is taller than the other, the gap between them is still gonna appear much larger than it should. This completely ruins the consistency and the point of using grids in the first place. This doesn't happen with Flexbox containers. So I really hope Elementor fixes this as soon as possible because it would make grids way more useful. But at the time of making this video, I'm still running into this issue. So as such, I only really use grids when I know the individual elements in the grid will have an identical height. There are a couple of things, some settings, some details that we did not go through that may be useful in some cases. But after using Elementor for years to build client websites, I've never needed them, I never used them, which is why I didn't include them in this video. With that said, if you got to this point in the video, you're now familiar with pretty much all of the theory and all of the settings you need to build the large majority of website layouts. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how to use what we just learned to build a few different layouts. We're going to go through the process of building out a couple of different sections, some that are very common and that you're likely going to run into all the time, and a few more special, challenging ones. If you want to see that video, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get notified. You can also subscribe to my newsletter and you're going to get an email every time I release a video. I highly recommend doing that. Just saying. And if you're watching this in the future, which technically you are, check the description, check the links. It's very likely that the video is out already waiting for you. If this video was helpful, go check out this one next. If you found this one interesting, I guarantee you're gonna find that one very interesting as well. Thank you for watching.